There are periods in life where nothing seems to work, not for a day or two, but for weeks, sometimes months long enough that it starts to feel personal, like life itself has turned against you. Every effort leads to frustration, every attempt ends in disappointment, and slowly you begin to expect things to go wrong before they even happen. If you've been there, you know how heavy that state feels. If you're in it right now, you know how difficult it is to even think about changing it. But this situation is not random, and more importantly, it's not permanent. There is a structure behind it. There is a mechanism that explains why everything feels stuck, and more importantly, how to reverse it. Human behavior is deeply influenced by two forces, inertia and momentum. When nothing is moving, it becomes harder and harder to start. When things are already in motion, they tend to keep going. This is not just physics, it's psychology. What you're experiencing when life isn't going your way is not just bad luck, it's inertia. And once you understand that, you can begin to do something about it. The longer something stays stuck, the harder it becomes to move. That's the nature of inertia. It builds quietly, almost invisibly, but its effects are heavy and real. It's like being caught in wet cement. The more time passes, the more solid it becomes, the harder it is to break free. This is why habits are so difficult to change. They are not just behaviors, they are patterns reinforced over time, often for years, sometimes decades. And all that time creates resistance. Inertia doesn't just affect what you do, it affects how you think, how you feel, and how you interpret reality. When things aren't going your way for long enough, your perception begins to shift. You start noticing more of what's going wrong and less of what's going right. Your memory becomes selective, recalling failures more vividly than successes. Your emotional baseline drops, motivation fades, hope feels less convincing. And even when you know, logically, what you should be doing, there's a gap between knowing and acting. That gap is inertia at work. At the same time, there is an opposite force, momentum. Momentum is what happens when things are already in motion. It's why some people seem to move through difficulties without completely falling apart. Their lives are not perfect. They face setbacks like anyone else, but they have enough forward movement that those setbacks don't stop them entirely. They slow them down, but they don't freeze them in place. Momentum, like inertia, compounds over time. The more movement there is, the easier it becomes to keep moving. The more wins you accumulate, the more confidence you build. The more confidence you build, the more willing you are to act. And the more you act, the more opportunities you create for additional wins. It becomes a cycle, but unlike inertia, it's a constructive one. From a structural standpoint, inertia and momentum are not separate systems. They are two expressions of the same underlying principle, resistance to change. When something is not moving, it resists starting. When something is moving, it resists stopping. In both cases, what matters is force, the force required to change direction. When you're stuck in a period where nothing is going your way, what you're really dealing with is accumulated inertia. And the longer that period lasts, the more that inertia grows. It begins to influence not just your behavior, but your identity. You don't just feel stuck, you start to see yourself as someone who is stuck. That's when it becomes especially dangerous, because now the inertia is not just external, it's internalized. In that state, big changes feel unrealistic. The idea of making a major move, achieving something significant, or suddenly turning everything around can feel almost absurd. Those kinds of wins seem distant, inaccessible, like they belong to a completely different version of you. And when something feels that far away, it doesn't motivate you, it discourages you. It reinforces the belief that nothing will change. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume that the way out of a bad period is through a big breakthrough, a major win that instantly changes everything. But from within inertia, those kinds of wins are not just difficult, they are psychologically out of reach. Trying to chase them too early often makes things worse, because failure at that level only deepens the sense of stagnation. The key insight is this: Momentum is not created by massive victories. It is created by accumulated force. And force can come from very small actions, as long as those actions are consistent and recognized. When you're deep in inertia, your threshold for what counts as a meaningful achievement is often too high. You dismiss small actions because they don't seem significant enough. You tell yourself that they don't count, but that judgment is part of the inertia itself. It keeps you from generating the very force you need to move. If you look at it objectively, a win is simply any action that moves you in a constructive direction. It doesn't have to be impressive. It doesn't have to be visible to others. It just has to exist. And more importantly, it has to be acknowledged. Because without recognition, even real progress can feel like nothing. And when progress feels like nothing, it doesn't generate momentum. So the problem is not just that you're stuck, it's that your system for measuring progress is misaligned with your current state. You're using the standards of someone with momentum while you're operating from inertia. And that mismatch ensures that almost everything you do feels insufficient. Understanding this changes the approach entirely. It means that the first step is not to aim higher, it's to adjust the threshold, to redefine what counts as a win in a way that is actually achievable from where you are right now. This is not lowering standards permanently. It's recalibrating them temporarily so that movement becomes possible again. Because without movement, nothing changes. But once movement begins, even at a small scale, the conditions start to shift. And that shift is where momentum begins. So the question becomes, how do you actually generate that initial movement when you're deep in inertia? The answer is not through intensity, not through sudden bursts of motivation, and not through waiting to feel ready. It's through deliberately reducing your threshold of achievement to a level where failure becomes almost impossible. If you're stuck, truly stuck, then the first step is not impressive. It's almost embarrassingly small, but that's exactly the point. You are creating conditions where action is guaranteed, because action, not intention, is what produces force. And force, when accumulated, becomes momentum. What does that look like in practice? It means redefining a win down to the smallest unit of constructive behavior that is entirely within your control. You got out of bed, that counts. You changed your clothes, that counts. You brushed your teeth, that counts. These are not symbolic gestures, they are real actions. And more importantly, they are actions you can complete without relying on anyone else or any external circumstances. The control is fully yours. At first, this will feel strange. It may even feel beneath you. There's a natural tendency to judge these actions as insignificant or even pathetic. But that reaction is not objective. It's a cognitive defense mechanism that serves the inertia. It keeps your standards artificially high so that you remain inactive. In other words, that voice telling you this doesn't count is part of the problem, not a reliable evaluator of progress. If you shift your perspective, the relativity becomes obvious. For someone with a severe physical limitation, getting out of bed could be a major accomplishment. The value of an action is always relative to the difficulty of performing it within a given state. And right now, your state is constrained, so the scale must adjust accordingly. Once you've defined these small, controllable wins, the next step is critical. You must acknowledge them, not passively, not internally, but explicitly. When you complete a task, you recognize it. You tell yourself, good job. You reinforce the behavior. You make the success visible to yourself. This might feel unnatural at first, especially if you're not used to affirming your own actions. But the absence of recognition is part of what keeps inertia in place. When effort goes unnoticed, even by you, it feels meaningless. And when it feels meaningless, you stop doing it. Recognition converts action into psychological reward, and that reward is what sustains repetition. In the beginning, you may be the only one acknowledging these wins. That's fine. In fact, it's expected. External validation is not required at this stage. What matters is that the system starts working internally. You act, you recognize the action, and you create a feedback loop. As these small wins accumulate, something subtle begins to change. You start to experience what can be called a win chain, a sequence of successful actions over time. One win leads to another, not because each action is significant on its own, but because together they create continuity. And continuity is what generates momentum. When you go from a day with no wins to a day with several, even small ones, the difference is not trivial, it's structural. You've shifted from stagnation to movement, and once movement exists, it can be built upon. Over time, as this pattern stabilizes, your internal state begins to adjust. You feel slightly more capable, slightly more willing to act. The resistance doesn't disappear, but it weakens. And as it weakens, you can begin to raise the threshold of what counts as a win. Now your wins become slightly more demanding. You applied for a job, that counts. You prepared a proper meal, that counts. You visited a gym, even if you didn't work out, that counts. The actions are still within your control, but they require a bit more effort, a bit more engagement with the external world. And just like before, you acknowledge them, you reinforce them, you maintain the chain. At this stage, something else starts to happen. Other people may begin to notice, not necessarily immediately and not necessarily in a dramatic way, but the changes become visible. The wins are larger now, more aligned with conventional standards of progress. But even here, the external recognition is secondary. The system was built without it, and it continues to function regardless of it. The key is that you don't stop adjusting. You continue to calibrate your threshold so that you are consistently achieving more than you are failing, at least in your own perception. This doesn't mean avoiding difficulty. It means structuring your actions so that success remains frequent enough to sustain momentum. Even once you are no longer stuck, this process doesn't end. It becomes a way of operating. Some days, your wins will be significant. Other days, they will be small. But you adapt the scale accordingly to keep the momentum intact. You protect the streak not by lowering standards permanently, but by adjusting them intelligently based on your current state. This is how momentum is built and maintained, not through occasional breakthroughs, but through continuous, acknowledged progress. It's a system that turns effort into movement and movement into direction. And once that direction is established, you are no longer at the mercy of inertia. You are actively shaping where you go next. What feels like being stuck is not a mystery, it's inertia. And inertia doesn't break on its own, it has to be interrupted with force. Not massive force, not dramatic change, but consistent, controlled action that you can actually execute. That's where everything begins. The moment you start generating small, undeniable wins, you begin shifting direction. At first, it's subtle, almost unnoticeable, but over time, those small actions accumulate. They create movement, and that movement becomes momentum. Once momentum exists, everything changes. The same setbacks that once stopped you completely now only slow you down. The same actions that once felt impossible start to feel manageable. Your perception shifts, your emotional state stabilizes, and gradually you move from reacting to your situation to shaping it. This is not about waiting for motivation. It's about building a system that works even when motivation is absent. Reduce the threshold, take action, acknowledge the win, and repeat. That's the cycle. Because in the end, no one is coming to pull you out of inertia. The responsibility is yours. But so is the power. And if you stay consistent long enough, you won't just get unstuck, you become someone who keeps moving forward.